Miracles like this don't happen to people like us, suddenly. We had house keys in our hands. The story you're about to hear is a true account. The names of characters and places have been changed to preserve the privacy of its authors. If you believe in miracles or have experienced one, leave your opinion in the comments and subscribe. I still remember that night as if it were yesterday. The air was charged with an inexplicable tension when my father came out of that church meeting. I was waiting outside, sitting on the curb, playing with some stones I found on the ground. The night's cold chilled my bones, but we knew we couldn't afford to turn on the heater in the borrowed car. I saw my father come out through the church doors, his figure illuminated by the warm light emanating from inside. I noticed something different in his face, a mixture of confusion and hope that I hadn't seen before. Behind him came a man I didn't recognize. He was tall, with a graying beard and eyes that seemed to shine with supernatural intensity. "Dad!" I shouted, jumping up. "Are we going home now?" My father gestured for me to wait and turned to the unknown man. I saw them exchange some words in low voices, and then, to my surprise, the man pointed directly at the car we were using. "That car," said the man with a voice that seemed to resonate in the night air, "will be yours soon." I froze. How could he say something like that? Didn't he know that car belonged to the elderly couple from church? That we barely had enough to eat, much less to buy a car? "Sir," I intervened, unable to contain myself, "you don't understand. That car isn't ours. We only—" "Quiet, son." My father interrupted me, with a voice that mixed authority and amazement. He turned to the man and asked, "How can you be so sure?" The man smiled, a smile that seemed to illuminate all the darkness around us. "Faith moves mountains, my friend, and I see great faith in you and your family. Trust what I tell you." With those words, the man turned around and disappeared into the night, leaving my father and me in a state of confusion and amazement. "Dad," I whispered, pulling on his sleeve, "who was that man? Why did he say that about the car?" My father kept staring at the spot where the man had disappeared, as if expecting him to reappear from nowhere. "I don't know, son," he finally responded, his voice barely audible. "But something tells me we should believe him." We got into the car in silence, the engine coughing as it started as it always did. As we drove away from the church, I couldn't help but look in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see the mysterious man watching us. But the street was empty, illuminated only by the dim light of the street lamps. "Do you really think we'll have this car, Dad?" I asked, breaking the silence. My father sighed deeply. "Faith is believing in the impossible, son. And if there's anything I've learned in this life, it's that sometimes the impossible happens." We made the rest of the journey home in silence, but I could feel that something had changed. A seed of hope had been planted in our hearts, and although I tried not to get too excited, I couldn't help thinking about the possibilities. What if it really happened? What if that mysterious man was right? That night, I had trouble falling asleep. The man's words echoed in my head over and over. "That car will be yours soon." I finally fell asleep, dreaming of endless roads and a future that, for the first time in a long time, seemed a little brighter. Weeks passed, and the prophecy of that stranger kept turning in our heads. Every time we got into the borrowed car, I felt a mixture of hope and anxiety. Would today be the day? How could something like this happen? One Sunday afternoon, after the church service, I saw my father talking quietly with Don Alberto and Dona Rosa, the elderly couple who owned the car. They were standing next to the vehicle, and for a moment, I felt my heart leap out of my chest. Could it be? I approached stealthily, trying to hear the conversation. "We can't drive like we used to," Don Alberto was saying, his voice trembling with age. "And you have been so good to us." "But we can't accept it," my father responded, his voice full of contained emotion. "It's too much." Dona Rosa took my father's hand in hers. "Son," she said with a warm smile, "it would be an honor for us. Besides, what would we do with two cars? We barely use the other one anymore." I couldn't contain myself any longer. "Are you giving us the car?" I exclaimed, coming out of my hiding place. The three adults turned to me, surprised by my sudden appearance. I saw how my father opened his mouth to scold me for eavesdropping, but Don Alberto beat him to it. "That's right, young man," he said with a little laugh. "This car needs someone to take care of it and use it as it deserves. And I can't think of anyone better than you." I was speechless, looking alternately at my father and the elderly couple. Was this really happening? Was this the miracle that mysterious man had predicted? But how? I stammered. "Why us?" Dona Rosa came closer and caressed my cheek tenderly. "God works in mysterious ways, sweetie. Sometimes, blessings come in the most unexpected forms." I saw how my father struggled against tears. "I don't know what to say," he mumbled. It's a miracle." Don Alberto took the car keys from his pocket and put them in my father's hand. "It's yours now," he said with an enigmatic smile that reminded me of the man from that night. "Use it well and always remember that God provides." At that moment, it felt as if the world stopped. The bustle of people leaving the church, the singing of birds in the nearby trees, everything seemed to fade away. There were only the four of us in that car, silent witness to a miracle that was happening before our eyes. My father, with trembling hands, accepted the keys. I saw how the tears he had been holding back finally rolled down his cheeks. "Thank you," he said with a broken voice. "Thank you. You don't know what this means to us." I also felt a lump in my throat. I wanted to scream with joy, jump, hug everyone. But at the same time, part of me remained incredulous. How was it possible that the words of that stranger had come true? "Go on," said Don Alberto, giving us a little push toward the car. "Take it for a spin. Enjoy your new vehicle." With trembling hands, my father opened the driver's door. I ran to the passenger seat, feeling the worn leather under my fingers in a completely new way. It was no longer the borrowed car we could occasionally use. It was ours, really ours. The engine roared to life, and this time, the sound seemed like the most beautiful in the world. As we drove away, I saw Don Alberto and Dona Rosa in the rearview mirror, waving goodbye with smiles on their faces. "Dad," I said after a few minutes of silence, "do you think this has something to do with what that man said the other night?" My father glanced at me, an expression of amazement still on his face. "I don't know, son, but if I've learned anything today, it's that miracles exist, and that we should never lose faith." We drove around the city, with no fixed destination, simply enjoying the feeling of freedom that our new car gave us. And as I watched the streets pass by the window, I felt that something had changed inside me. Faith, which had always been something abstract, something I heard about in church but had never really experienced, had suddenly become tangible. I could touch it, feel it, drive it. That night, when we returned home, my mother was waiting at the door, worried about our lateness. When we told her what had happened, she fell to her knees, crying and laughing at the same time. "It's a miracle," she repeated over and over. "A true miracle." And as we hugged her, surrounded by the starry night and with the keys to our new car in hand, I knew I had witnessed something extraordinary, something that would change our lives forever. And I wondered, with a mixture of excitement and fear, what other miracles the future held for us. Several weeks passed since we received the car. Each day, seeing it parked in front of our modest house, I felt a mixture of gratitude and amazement. It was a constant reminder that miracles existed, that faith could move mountains, or at least, give away cars. One Sunday morning, my father surprised us all. "Today," he said during breakfast, "I'm going to share our story in church." My mother and I exchanged surprised looks. My father wasn't one to speak in public, much less about such personal things. "Are you sure, honey?" my mother asked, taking his hand. He nodded with determination. "It's time for others to know what God has done for us. Maybe our story can give hope to someone else." We arrived at church earlier than usual. I could feel the tension in the air, the anticipation. My father approached the pastor before the service and asked for a few minutes to speak. The pastor, surprised but pleased, agreed immediately. When the moment came, I saw my father stand up and walk to the pulpit. His hands were shaking slightly, but his voice was firm when he began to speak. "Brothers and sisters," he started, "today I want to share with you a miracle that has occurred in our lives." The silence in the church was absolute. All eyes were fixed on my father as he related the story of the mysterious man, his prophecy about the car and how, against all odds, it had come true. And so, out of nowhere, Don Alberto and Dona Rosa gave us their car, my father concluded, with tears in his eyes. A car that we could never have dreamed of having. A gift from God, manifested through the generosity of our brothers in Christ. I could see how the story impacted the congregation. Some were crying silently, others nodding in amazement. The atmosphere in the church was electric, charged with renewed emotion and faith. Suddenly, a voice rose from the back of the church. "The car is just the beginning." We all turned to see who had spoken. It was a man I had never seen before, tall, with gray hair and bright eyes. For a moment, I thought it might be the same mysterious man from that night. But no, this one was different. The man stood up, visibly trembling, as if he were fighting against an invisible force. "God is showing me something," he said with a broken voice. "I see you. I see you in your own house." A murmur ran through the congregation. My mother stifled a cry beside me. I remained paralyzed, unable to process what I was hearing. "A house?" My father repeated from the pulpit, his voice barely a whisper. The man nodded fervently. "Yes, a house. God is showing it to me as clearly as I see you now. It's a modest house, but full of love and blessings. And it's yours." The silence that followed these words was deafening. I could hear my own heart beating furiously in my ears. A house? For us? It was simply impossible. "Brother," said the pastor, approaching the man, "are you sure of what you're saying?" "As sure as I'm standing here," the man replied. "God has given me this vision to share with you. This family has witnessed a miracle, and there will be more to come." I couldn't contain myself anymore. I stood up, trembling with emotion and fear. "But that's impossible," I shouted, feeling all eyes on me. "We barely have enough to eat. How could we have a house?" I saw the pain in my parents' eyes at my words, but I couldn't stop myself. "How dare you give false hope?" I continued, my words coming out in an unstoppable torrent. "You don't know how poor we are." The silence that followed was absolute. I could hear my mother's stifled sobs, the uncomfortable murmur of the congregation. I felt ashamed of my outburst, but at the same time, I couldn't bear the idea of another disappointment. The man with the vision approached me slowly, his eyes, full of compassion, locked with mine. "Son," he said softly, "I understand your fear. I understand your doubt. But remember, just a few weeks ago, having that car also seemed impossible, didn't it?" His words hit me like a punch to the stomach. He was right. The car had been a miracle, something we never thought possible. Faith, the man continued, isn't about believing only in what we can see or understand. It's about trusting that God has a plan, even when we can't see it. I felt tears running down my cheeks. I wanted to believe, I really wanted to, but the fear of disappointment was so great. My father came down from the pulpit and hugged me tightly. "Son," he whispered in my ear, "I know it's hard to believe, but if we've learned anything these past few weeks, it's that with God, everything is possible." As the congregation began to pray, embraced by my father and listening to my mother's sobs, I felt a mix of emotions that I couldn't describe. Fear, hope, doubt, faith. Everything mixed in a whirlwind inside me. Would it be possible? Could we really have our own house someday? The idea seemed so distant, so impossible. And yet, there I was, standing in a church, witness to a miracle that had already occurred and the promise of another to come. That night, as I lay in my bed, I couldn't help but look out the window, imagining what it would be like to have our own house. And although fear and doubt were still there, I felt a small spark of hope ignite in my heart. Perhaps, just perhaps, the miracles hadn't ended for our family. The words of that man in the church triggered a tumult in my soul that I couldn't control. The following days were an emotional roller coaster. On one hand, the hope of having our own house was exciting, almost intoxicating. On the other, the fear of disappointment was eating me up inside. One night, as we ate dinner in silence in our small kitchen, I couldn't contain myself anymore. The fork fell from my hand, making a strident noise against the plate. "How can you believe in this?" I exclaimed, breaking the silence. "A house? For us?" It's madness. My mother looked at me with eyes full of concern. Son, faith. Don't talk to me about faith. I interrupted, feeling how the frustration accumulated over days exploded. Faith doesn't pay bills. Faith doesn't build houses out of nothing. My father put down his spoon and looked at me intently. What about the car? Wasn't that a miracle? The car was different, I stammered, although deep down I knew I didn't have a solid argument. That was Don Alberto and Dona Rosa's generosity. But a house? Who's going to give us a house? God provides in mysterious ways, my mother said softly, trying to take my hand across the table. I pulled my hand away abruptly. Mysterious ways? Is that what we'll say when nothing happens? That God works in mysterious ways. I saw the pain in my parents' eyes, but I couldn't stop myself. All the doubts, all the fears I had been keeping inside, came out in an unstoppable torrent. What if nothing happens? I continued, feeling tears beginning to run down my cheeks. What if that man in the church was wrong? Or worse yet, what if he was lying? Don't say that, exclaimed my mother, horrified. That man was speaking with the Spirit of God. How do you know? I shouted, standing up so quickly that the chair fell behind me. How do we know he wasn't just someone seeking attention, or someone who wanted to give us false hope? My father rose slowly, his face a mask of calm that contrasted with the storm in his eyes. Son, he said firmly, I understand your fear. Believe me, I have doubts too. But what? I interrupted. Are we going to sit and wait for a house to fall from the sky? Are we going to reject job opportunities or moving to a cheaper place because we're waiting for a miracle? The silence that followed was deafening. I could hear my own heart beating furiously in my ears. My mother was sobbing silently, and my father seemed to be struggling with himself to maintain composure. We're not rejecting anything, my father finally said. We're still working, still saving what little we can. But we're also open to the possibility that God has a plan for us. A plan, I repeated bitterly. What if the plan is for us to stay poor? What if the plan is for us to never have our own house? Then we'll accept it. My father responded with a calmness that enraged me even more. Because faith isn't just about receiving blessings. It's about trusting God even when things don't go as we expect. His words hit me like a punch to the stomach. I wanted to scream. I wanted to break something. I wanted them to understand my frustration and fear. But instead, I collapsed on the floor, sobbing uncontrollably. I felt my mother's arms around me, and then my father's. We stayed like that, the three of us embracing on the kitchen floor, crying together. For our fears, for our hopes, for the uncertainty of the future. I'm sorry, I mumbled between sobs. It's just, I'm so afraid of getting my hopes up and then nothing happening. We know, sweetheart, whispered my mother, stroking my hair. We're afraid too. But you know what? Fear can't take away hope. My father nodded. Sometimes, son, faith is all we have left when everything else seems impossible. And sometimes, it's right in those moments when miracles happen. Gradually, my sobs subsided. The weight in my chest seemed to have lightened a bit. It hadn't disappeared completely, but it no longer crushed me like before. What if it really happens? I asked quietly, almost with shame. What if we really get a house? I saw a smile appear on my father's face. Then, my son, we will have witnessed another miracle, and our faith will have grown even stronger. That night, as I lay in my bed, I reflected on our conversation. The fear and doubt were still there, like shadows in the corners of my mind. But alongside them, there was something else. A small light of hope, dim but persistent. Perhaps, I thought as I closed my eyes, the true test of faith wasn't blindly believing in miracles. Maybe it was having the courage to wait, to keep going, even when everything seemed impossible. And with that thought, I fell asleep, dreaming of a house that didn't exist yet, but that maybe, just maybe, could one day be ours. Days turned into weeks, and weeks into months. Each morning, upon waking, I felt a mix of hope and anxiety churning in my stomach. Would today be the day? Would today bring the news that would change our lives forever? The sound of the doorbell became something that made me jump. Every time it rang, I would run to open it, half expecting to see someone there with the keys to our new house. But it was always something else. A neighbor asking for sugar, the mailman with bills, or some door-to-door salesperson. The phone didn't leave me in peace either. Every unexpected call made my heart race. Would this be the call we were waiting for? But time and again, they were just work calls from my father, or my aunt asking how we were doing. One afternoon, while doing my homework at the kitchen table, I heard my father speaking quietly with my mother in the living room. It's been 3 months now, my father was saying, his voice laden with worry. What if we were wrong? What if we misinterpreted everything? We have to have faith, my mother responded, though I could hear a tremor in her voice. God has his timing. I stayed still, holding my breath to hear better. I know, my father sighed. But I see the hope in the boy's eyes every morning, and it hurts to think we might be feeding an empty illusion. I felt a lump in my throat. Were my parents starting to doubt too? The following days were even harder. Every time I mentioned the house, I noticed how my parents exchanged worried looks. They tried to maintain optimism in front of me, but I could feel their unease growing. One night, I couldn't take it anymore. During dinner, I hit the table with my fist, making the plates jump. Enough! I shouted. Stop pretending everything is fine. Nothing is happening and nothing will happen. My mother dropped her fork, startled. Son, please. No. I interrupted. We've been waiting for months. How much longer are we going to continue with this? How much longer are we going to believe in fairy tales? I saw tears forming in my mother's eyes, and for a moment I felt guilty. But the frustration was stronger. My father looked at me intently. I understand your frustration, he said calmly. But faith. Don't talk to me about faith. I shouted, standing up. Faith doesn't pay the rent. Faith doesn't give us our own roof. We've been fools to believe in all this. I ran from the kitchen and locked myself in my room, throwing myself on the bed and burying my face in the pillow. I could hear my parents talking in low voices in the kitchen, but I didn't want to hear anymore. The following weeks were tense. I avoided talking about the house, and my parents seemed to do the same. The hope that once filled our house had vanished, replaced by an uncomfortable silence and worried glances. One afternoon, while walking back from school, I passed in front of a house for sale. It was small and needed some repairs, but for some reason, I stopped to look at it. For a moment, I allowed myself to imagine what it would be like to live there, to have a place we could really call home. I shook my head, trying to push away those thoughts. I couldn't allow myself to get excited again. That night, during dinner, my father spoke. I've been thinking, he said slowly, as if measuring each word. Maybe we should consider moving to a smaller apartment. To save more money. The silence that followed was deafening. My mother looked at him with wide eyes, and I felt as if someone had punched me in the stomach. Does that mean you no longer believe we'll have a house? I asked quietly. My father sighed deeply. It's not that I don't believe, son. It's just that we have to be realistic. We can't put our lives on hold for something that might not happen. I felt tears stinging my eyes. Despite my outburst of frustration days ago, a part of me was still clinging to that small hope. And now, hearing my father, who had always encouraged us to have faith, talking about being realistic, hurt more than I wanted to admit. Then it was all a lie. I mumbled. The man in the church, the vision, everything. We don't know that, my mother intervened, though her voice lacked the conviction it used to have. Maybe it just wasn't the right time. And when will be the right time? I asked, feeling bitterness taking over me. When we're old. When we no longer need it. Nobody answered. The silence at the table was heavy, loaded with broken dreams and vanished hopes. That night, lying in my bed, staring at the ceiling, I felt an emptiness in my chest that I hadn't experienced before. It wasn't just the disappointment of not having the house. It was the sensation of having lost something deeper. Faith in miracles, the belief that impossible things could happen. I closed my eyes, trying to remember how I felt months ago, when everything seemed possible. But that sensation had vanished, replaced by a cold, hard reality. Maybe, I thought as sleep overtook me, miracles are just for fairy tales. and we live in the real world. Weeks passed since that dinner when my father talked about moving to a smaller apartment. The atmosphere at home was heavy, as if a gray cloud had permanently settled over us. We avoided talking about the house, but its absence was like a ghost that haunted us in every conversation, in every glance. One Sunday morning, as we were getting ready for church, the phone rang. My father answered, and by his expression, I knew something had changed. His face went from confusion to amazement, and then to an emotion I couldn't decipher. Yes, I understand," he was saying. "We'll be there in an hour." When he hung up, he stared at the phone as if it were an alien object. "Who was it?" my mother asked, worry evident in her voice. My father looked at us, and for a moment, I saw a flash of the hope we thought was lost. "It was a lawyer," he said slowly. "He says we have to go to his office. It's about a house." The silence that followed was deafening. My mind was spinning, trying to process what I had just heard. A house? After all this time? What house? I finally managed to ask. "I don't know," my father responded. "He said we had to come in person, that it was urgent." The trip to the lawyer's office was surreal. Nobody spoke, but I could feel the tension, hope, and fear mixing in the air. When we arrived, a man in a suit greeted us with a kind smile. "Please come in," he said, leading us to his office. Once seated, the lawyer took some papers from an envelope. "I'm here representing Don Alberto," he began. My heart skipped a beat. Don Alberto, the man who had given us the car. What did he have to do with all this? "Unfortunately," the lawyer continued, "Don Alberto passed away a week ago." I felt as if I had been doused with cold water. Don Alberto, that kind man who had been the instrument of our first miracle, was no longer with us. But, the lawyer proceeded, before he died, he left very clear instructions about his will. "And this is where you come in." He took out a set of keys from his desk drawer and put them on the table in front of us. Don Alberto had a small property on the outskirts of the city, a modest house, but in good condition. And in his will, he specified that he wanted it to be for you. The world seemed to stop. I looked at my parents, who were as stunned as I was. Was this real? Was this really happening? But why? My mother managed to ask, her voice barely a whisper. The lawyer smiled. Don Alberto left a letter explaining his decision. He said that God had shown him that you needed a home, and that he wanted to be the instrument to make that miracle reality. I felt tears running down my cheeks. All this time, while we doubted, while we lost hope, the miracle was already in motion. "There are some formalities we need to complete," the lawyer continued, "but essentially, the house is yours. You can move in when you're ready." We left the lawyer's office in a state of shock. The keys in my father's hand seemed to shine under the morning sun. Without saying a word, we headed to the address we had been given. When we arrived, I was breathless. It was a small house, yes, but beautiful. A front garden, a cozy porch, large windows that let in the light. It was more than we had ever dreamed of. My father opened the door with trembling hands. The interior was simple but welcoming. Wooden floors, freshly painted walls, a small but functional kitchen. And most importantly, it was ours. I fell to my knees in the middle of the empty living room, sobbing uncontrollably. All the frustration, doubt, fear of the last months came out in a torrent of tears. "I'm sorry," I mumbled between sobs. "I'm sorry for having doubted, for having lost faith." My parents knelt beside me, hugging me tightly. "We all doubted," my father said softly, "but God had a plan, even when we couldn't see it." We stayed like that, embracing on the floor of our new house, crying and laughing at the same time. The walls seemed to vibrate with the energy of a million answered prayers. In that moment, I truly understood the power of faith and miracles. They don't always come when we expect them, nor in the way we imagine. But when they do, they transform our lives in ways we could never have foreseen. That night, we slept on the floor of our new living room, surrounded by boxes and furniture yet to be unpacked. But I didn't mind. For the first time in a long time, I truly felt at home. As I looked out the window, watching the stars shine in the night sky, I thought about Don Alberto, about the mysterious man from the church, about all those who had been part of this miracle. And I knew that, Although the path had been difficult and full of doubts, every moment had been worth it. Because now we had more than a house. We had a home, a living testimony that miracles exist, and that sometimes they come in the form of a roof over our heads and a place we can call our own.